firepower. Napoleon may have felt certain of victory, but he was not a reckless man. As always, he studied the situation from every angle. He knew, for instance, that Russian roads were notoriously bad. Local food supplies were meager. The climate tended to extremes of heat and cold, and the vast distances made it much harder to encircle the enemy. There was always room to retreat. He read up on the failed invasion of Russia by the King of Sweden, Charles XII, in 1709, and anticipated that the Russians might revert to a scorched earth policy. His army would have to be as self-sufficient as possible. The distances were too great to have extended supply lines from Europe. But given its size, that would require incredible planning and organization. To help provide for his army, Napoleon had vast storehouses close to the borders of Russia, filled with wheat and rice. He knew it would be impossible to provide fodder for the 150,000 horses of his army, and so thinking ahead, he decided they would have to wait until June for the invasion, when the grasses of the Russian plains would be rich and green. At the last minute, he learned Russia had very few mills to grind grain into flour, so he added to his growing list the need to bring materials to build mills along the way. With the logistical problems addressed and his usual well-devised strategy in hand, Napoleon told his ministers that he foresaw a complete victory within 3 weeks. In the past, these predictions of Napoleon's had been uncannily accurate. In June 1812, Napoleon's vast armada of men and supplies crossed into Russia. Napoleon always planned for the unexpected, but this time, unmanageable difficulties began to pile up almost immediately. Rain, the bad roads, the intense summer heat brought the army's movements to a crawl. Within days, more than 10,000 horses ate rank grass and died. Supplies were failing to reach the forward troops fast enough, and they had to resort to foraging. But the uncooperative Russian peasants along the march not only refused to sell their food at any price, but burned their hay rather than let the French have it. More French horses died when they were forced to feed off the thatch in the roofs of houses, only to find the houses collapsing on them. The two Russian armies in Lithuania retreated too fast to be caught, and as they went, they burned crops and destroyed all storehouses of food. Dysentery quickly spread through the French troops. Some 900 men died each day. In his effort to catch and destroy at least a part of his elusive enemy, Napoleon was compelled to march ever farther east. At points, he came tantalizingly close to the more northern of the two Russian armies, but his exhausted men and horses could not move fast enough to meet or encircle it, and it easily escaped his traps each time. June bled into July. Now it became clear that the Russians would be able to join their two armies at Smolensk, over 200 miles east of where Napoleon had intended to fight them, and a mere 280 miles from Moscow. Napoleon had to call a halt and rethink his plan. Thousands of French soldiers had succumbed to disease and hunger without a single battle being fought. The army was strung out along a 500-mile line, parts of which were constantly harassed by small troops of Cossacks on horseback, sowing terror with their bloodthirsty raids. Napoleon could not allow the chase to go on any longer. He would march his men to Smolensk and fight the decisive battle there. Smolensk was a holy city, with great emotional significance to the Russian people. Surely the Russians would fight to defend it rather than let it be destroyed. He knew that if he could only meet the Russians in battle, he would win. And so the French moved on Smolensk, arriving there in mid-August, their 450,000-man attack force reduced to 150,000 and worn down by the intense heat. Finally, as Napoleon had predicted, the Russians made a stand here, but only briefly. After several days of fighting, they retreated yet again, leaving behind a burned and ruined city with nothing in it to feed on or plunder. Napoleon could not understand the Russian people, who seemed to him suicidal. They would destroy their country rather than surrender it. Now he had to decide whether to march on Moscow itself. It might have seemed wise to wait through the winter at Smolensk, but that would give the Tsar time to raise a larger army that would prove too hard for Napoleon to handle with his own depleted forces. The French emperor felt certain the Tsar would defend Moscow, the very heart and soul of Russia. Once Moscow fell, Alexander would have to sue for peace. So Napoleon marched his haggard troops still farther east. Now, at last, the Russians turned to face the French in battle, and on September 7th, the two armies clashed near the village of Borodino, a mere 75 miles from Moscow. Napoleon no longer had enough forces or cavalry to attempt his usual flanking maneuver, so he was forced to attack the enemy head-on. The Russians fought bitterly, harder than any army Napoleon had ever faced. Even so, after hours of brutal fighting, the Russians retreated yet again. The road to Moscow lay open. But the Russian army was still intact, and Napoleon's forces had suffered horrific casualties. 7 days later, Napoleon's army, now reduced to 100,000 men, straggled into an undefended Moscow. A French marshal wrote to his wife that the emperor's joy was overflowing. "The Russians, he thinks, will sue for peace, and I shall change the face of the world." In earlier years, when he had marched into Vienna and Berlin, he had been met as a conquering hero, with dignitaries turning over to him the keys to their cities. But Moscow was empty. No citizens, no food. A terrible fire broke out almost immediately and lasted 5 days. All of the city's water pumps had been removed. An elaborate sabotage to make Moscow still more inhospitable. Napoleon sent letters to the Tsar, offering generous terms of peace. At first, the Russians seemed willing to negotiate, but the weeks went by, and it finally became clear that they were dragging out the talks to buy time to build up their army, and to let winter grow closer. Napoleon could not risk staying in Moscow another day. The Russians would soon be able to encircle his now meager force. On October 19th, he marched the remains of his army out of the Russian capital. His goal was to get to Smolensk as fast as possible. Now those undisciplined bands of Cossacks that had harassed him on the road east had formed into larger divisions, guerrilla forces of 500 men, and every day they killed off more and more French soldiers. Marching in constant fear, Napoleon's men rarely slept. Thousands succumbed to fatigue and hunger. Napoleon was forced to lead them past the nightmarish fields of Borodino, still crowded with French corpses, many half-eaten by wolves. The snow began to fall. The Russian winter set in. The French horses died from the cold, and every last soldier had to trudge through the snow on foot. Barely 40,000 made it to Smolensk. The cold was worsening. There was no time to tarry in Smolensk. Through some deft maneuvering, Napoleon managed to get his troops across the Berezina River, allowing them a clear line of retreat to the west. Then, in early December, hearing of a failed coup d'etat at home in France, he left his troops behind and headed for Paris. Of the 450,000 men in his main attack force, some 25,000 made it back.